With the third integrated flight test quickly approaching, SpaceX decided to slow down work on various projects around Starbase this week to focus on making Ship 28 and Booster 10 flight ready. Haha, we're just kidding, of course. You know by now the action never stops at the gateway to Mars, with this week being no exception. We got a huge list of updates to go through, and as a bonus, make sure to stick around towards the end of this video to get an interesting flyover update on the Starship launch infrastructure being developed down at Cape Canaveral, courtesy of the great Greg Scott. Now, without further ado, let's dig in. The chopsticks on the orbital launch integration tower opened to the launch position as a second wet dress rehearsal of Ship 28 and Booster 10 was attempted on Friday. The propellant storage and conditioning equipment began setting up early in the morning with cryogenic conditioning of the propellant lines venting on both the launch mount and the tower. After conditioning, the ship and booster began to be loaded with propellants. Not long into the prop load, the wet dress rehearsal was aborted and the booster and ship were detanked. With testing concluded for the day, the chopsticks were raised and secured to Starship 28 to stabilize the vehicle stack. Steel work for the new roadside extension Starfactory continued in front of the existing building, with the new hall rising on the foundations that were laid over the past month. After 2 unsuccessful wet dress rehearsals, work began to destack the ship on Sunday, beginning with the ship quick disconnect detaching from Ship 28. SpaceX's LR-11000 lifting hook was attached to the 2-point ship lifter for removal from its stand as workers prepare for a future static fire of Ship 28. The static fire will verify that the engines, which were switched out in the previous weeks, are working correctly. While the 2-point lifter work was underway, Starship 28 was destacked from Booster 10. The ship was soon set down on its transport stand to await its relocation to Test Stand B. Shortly before midnight, crews finished connecting Starship 28 to the ground pressurization systems. The chopsticks were then released from the ship and it set down at the base of the tower. Early on Monday morning, cladding work began at the top of Mega Bay 1's doorway, covering up the folding door's topside storage space. Over at the launch site, Ship 28 was prepared for transport, beginning with the closure of the aft flaps. The forward flaps were then closed and secured with chains to keep them in place. With preparations complete, Starship 28 moved out from between the chopsticks and headed towards Test Stand B and the awaiting crane. With Starship 28 out of the way, the booster transport stand was staged near the orbital launch mount to take Booster 10 back to the build site. A convoy of trucks carrying heavy equipment for the propellant farm arrived at the launch site as the new facility's build-out shows no sign of slowing down. All told, 6 vaporizers, 2 cryogenic storage tanks for liquid nitrogen, and a batch of structural steel were delivered. Augers began piling work for SpaceX's planned 6-level parking garage on the corner of Remedios Avenue and Boca Chica Boulevard. Construction is expected to finish by the 1st of July. Crews removed the shoring for the new restrooms building at the launch site. The heavily reinforced facilities are a replacement for the previous, lightly built steel structure that was destroyed during IFT-1. The 4 tower segments for the second launch tower arrived in the Port of Brownsville a full day ahead of schedule. The second tower is planned to be built at the current Starship test stand area, pending approval from the Army Corps of Engineers. Outside the build site on the corner of San Martin Boulevard and Boca Chica Boulevard, crews began placing concrete for SpaceX's new $100 million office building. Capping off one of the busiest hours we've ever seen here at Starbase, the 2-point lifter was taken off of its stand and brought over to Starship 28. With the help of workers on protectively padded lifts to save the heat shields from damage, the lifting arms were maneuvered into place and connected to the ship. The launch tower was then prepared for the removal of Booster 10 from the orbital launch mount. First, the ship quick disconnect arm was retracted, then the chopsticks were raised and placed around the booster, slotting the stabilizers into place for the lift. Amid the ongoing work at the launch site, an unused vertical tank was removed from behind the water tanks at the flame deflector tank farm. The tanks were then laid flat in a tandem lift and placed on a trailer to be shipped out. The tank then departed the launch complex, passing the waiting convoy of trucks, and was taken temporarily to the SPMT yard. After several hours of work, crews completed the concrete pour at the site of the new office building early in the afternoon. The expansion of the new Starfactory hall continues to grow to its full length. Owing to its relatively simple design, being just an outer wall and its roof, workers are making rapid progress putting this part of the factory together. Assembly of Tower Section 8, the second to the last level of Starbase's second tower, is almost complete. The diagonal support beams are only loosely attached to make the tower segment easier to stack during construction. Back at the launch complex, workers began unloading the storage tanks that arrived earlier in the day. Using these two cranes, the tanks were offloaded and set upright. Once the second crane was detached, the new storage tanks were placed on their footings in front of the propellant storage tanks. Several hours after their arrival, one of the trucks still carrying 2 of the 6 new vaporizers departed from the launch site. Over at Test Stand B, crews finalized their preparations for lift, capping off the ship's ground connection interfaces and releasing it from the transport stand. Starship 28 was then lifted onto Test Stand B for static fire testing. While Ship 28 was being lifted, the second of the 2 new vertical tanks was lifted into place. With the new tanks in place, workers began unloading the vaporizers, and 4 of them were set down near the tanks at the front of the launch complex. Late in the afternoon, the ground interface panel was detached and retracted from Booster 10. The booster quick disconnect was unexpectedly reattached to Booster 10 2 hours later. After the earlier seemingly false start, Booster 10 was removed from the orbital launch mount and placed on the booster transport stand for its return once again to Mega Bay 1. Tuesday began the delivery of flight termination system components to the launch site. Explosive charges are used to destroy the vehicle in the event of an anomaly and are stored in an explosive bunker while waiting for installation before flight. This truck was bearing explosives 1.1D placards, so may have been carrying the actual C4 explosive charges. About 40 minutes later, a second delivery followed. This time, the truck did not bear any external placards, but a package marked explosives 1.4D and detonators electric for blasting were spotted being taken into the bunker. Over at the Massey's outpost, rebar cages were installed in the ground as foundation work continues at the site. A large rusty storage tank was spotted moving down Highway 4 towards Starbase and then into Massey's Way. The old storage tank, built in 1979, is a practical demonstration of SpaceX's resourcefulness as it continues to buy hardware wherever and whenever it is available. The large diameter port added onto the tank resembles what we saw with the water tanks at the launch site's flame deflector tank farm, a likely hint as to the use for this tank. Looking down Remedios Avenue, the LR-1300 lattice boom crane used during the construction of Mega Bay 2 was laid down for disassembly. With construction underway, to carry the weight of the new concrete parking garage on soft soil, deep piles are needed. A continuous flight auger drills deep holes into the earth, which are filled with rebar and concrete. Construction workers began placing concrete inside the orbital tank farm. It seems that SpaceX is placing supports for new equipment in the area where the 2 vertical tanks were removed in recent months. Wrapping work on the propellant farm water tank is still underway as workers gradually add the last of the metal jacketing. After their quick unloading the day before, the vaporizers were relocated from the space in front of the newly added vertical storage tanks. Inside the launch complex, Booster 10 was maneuvered out of the chopsticks and around the propellant tanks before making its way to Highway 4 for its journey back to the build site. At the conclusion of its journey, Booster 10 pulled into the build site and made its way to Mega Bay 1 for modifications or repairs for the next wet dress rehearsal ahead of its launch. Flight 3, which is currently expected sometime in early to mid-March, is the first of as many as 9 Starship flights SpaceX is planning to fly this year out of Starbase. If all goes well, 2024 is shaping up to be a very exciting year for spaceflight. With structural steel work nearing completion, roofing materials and braced exterior walls are being delivered and installed around and above the new Starfactory assembly hall. After lifting the rocket off the transport stand, Booster 10 was placed on the center stand of Mega Bay 1. Following the arrival of Booster 10, the 4th section of Booster 14's liquid oxygen tank emerged from Starfactory. Showing the advantages of the new factory, the newly built liquid oxygen tank section has clean welds and an unblemished surface finish. The third section of Booster 14's liquid oxygen tank was then rolled into the bay and the fourth section staged outside. The third section of Booster 14's liquid oxygen tank was then placed underneath the prior two sections, which were then stacked on top of it. Large batches of roofing materials were delivered and placed on top of the new Starfactory hall on Wednesday. While the existing construction moves towards exterior protective work, deliveries of the new structural steel show no sign of slowing down, while crews juggle an increasingly complex delivery schedule of building materials. Production tooling for Mega Bay 2's working areas has been manufactured, and crews have begun installation of various components in Mega Bay 2, such as the turntable base for ship stacking operations. At the site of the new office building, workers began assembling a crawler crane to be used during its construction. Spotted here is a booster aft dome being worked on outside Starfactory. Aft dome section assembly, which has been done indoors from some time now, normally keeps these parts out of sight. The new crawler crane was quickly assembled, raising its main boom and moving around the construction site. A stainless steel structure of unknown purpose, which had previously been delivered to the launch site, was seen being taken away again. Another similar structure was last seen entering the build site. New concrete formwork began at the orbital tank farm as workers remained busy building foundations for all the new hardware arriving each week. Pallets of pipe and pipe holders stand ready, illustrating the scope of ongoing work at the launch complex. New equipment means more power and more power management. To that end, a new electrical transformer was delivered to the launch site. With the ship and booster off the launch mount, work began on modifying the chopstick stabilizer and ship lifting pins. The silvery protective water tank jacket reached the top of the tank, leaving just the roof to finish up. With Starbase becoming more and more important to SpaceX's plans, space inside the village is getting tight. To free up valuable space, the 3 Tesla Megapacks in front of the former solar farm site were relocated to the Sanchez site, joining the 3 packs already there to supply backup power to Starbase. Seen here is an extra-large vaporizer spotted on a trailer outside Starbase shortly before its delivery to the launch complex. Concrete work continued within the perimeter of the orbital tank farm, and it's likely to support additional heavy equipment in the near future. Taking a look inside Mega Bay 1, we can see the first 3 sections of Booster 14's liquid oxygen tank stacked on the turntable in the front right corner. Quick assembly work will definitely be needed here to reach SpaceX's flight goal this year. The 2 remaining Tesla Megapacks relocated from the village were installed in their new location in the early afternoon. With Ship 28 scheduled to remain at Test Stand B for the time being, the ship transport stand departed the launch complex and headed back to the build site as the clock rolled over into Thursday morning. An hour later, a second ship transport stand made its appearance, rolling down Highway 4 towards the launch complex. With a single row of transporters and no counterweights, the second ship transport stand arrived at the launch complex quickly. Another round of concrete pour began early that morning, starting at the northwest end of the office site. Early in the afternoon, a mini excavator began removing the gravel that had previously been laid at the D2 gate so the LR-11,000 crane could reach the orbital tank farm's vertical tanks. After 12 hours of a continuous pour, the concrete crews finally finished their work at the northwest side of the office site. A second pour started 30 minutes later, but this one wrapped up quickly, and the pour was completed within an hour. The support stand for the 2-point lifter was brought out of the launch complex, suggesting that Ship 28 may remain attached to its crane support for now. The launch tower chopsticks were then put through their paces, performing a wiggle test before being opened to their launch position and then setting back down at the tower base. This week at the Cape, Doug returned to port with both fairing halves from the classified USSF-124 mission. Bob followed later in the day, returning to port with the fairing halves from the Intuitive Machines 1 Nova C mission, which landed on the moon's southern polar region near the Malapert A crater before toppling onto its side on February 22nd. Once the fairing halves were unloaded, Doug then departed Port Canaveral for sea trials. Cygnet Warhorse 3 towed Just Read the Instructions to sea for the Indonesian HTS-113BT communication satellite launch. Taking advantage of its much higher speed, Bob joined Just Read the Instructions in support of the HTS-113BT mission on Saturday. Falcon 9 lifted off from Space Launch Complex 40 on Tuesday the 20th, lofting Indonesia's HST-113BT into a geostationary transport orbit. 2 hours later, Doug towed a short follow gravitas out to sea once more in support of the Starlink Group 6-39 mission. Bob returned to Port Canaveral from the HST-113BT mission on Thursday with just one fairing half on board. The great Greg Scott took to the Florida skies once again this week, bringing us an aerial update on Florida's Space Coast. At NASA's Launch Complex 39B, Mobile Launcher 1 remains at the pad for testing. From these photos, we can see the steel cables of the launch tower's escape system. These cables will have to be disconnected for the platform's rollback to the vehicle assembly building for stacking of the Artemis II SLS launch vehicle. Over by the vehicle assembly building, we can see Crawler Transporter 1 with its rust-covered treads. While Crawler Transporter 2 was upgraded for use as part of the Artemis program, this vehicle sits unused following the cancellation of Northrop Grumman's Omega program in 2020. Over at the West Park site, NASA's Mobile Launch Platform 1 has made an appearance. Not to be confused with Mobile Launcher 1, which we see is still at the LC-39B, this platform is not currently used for launches. It got its start as part of the Apollo program and was later used for over 50 space shuttle launches. In recent years, NASA loaded the platform with a concrete ballast and uses it to condition the crawlerway to prepare it for transits of the SLS rockets. Nearby at the East Park site, construction of Mobile Launcher 2 is now well underway. This new launch platform will be used for the larger Block 1B and Block 2 variants of the SLS rocket. At Historic Launch Complex 39A, the transporter erector is laid down on the pad for reconfiguration. Early next month, NASA's Crew 8 mission is scheduled to launch from this site. At SpaceX's Space Launch Complex 40, we can see that the new tower appears complete. This tower with its crew access arm will give SpaceX launch pad redundancy for both its cargo and Crew Dragon capsules. It's not yet known what the first Dragon launch from this pad will be, but we're expecting it this year. We were lucky enough to catch a Falcon 9 fairing with the payload inside being transported down Saturn Causeway on its way to the pad for integration. We can see the extensive equipment that is required to move the payload to keep the proper conditions inside the fairing. Shifting over to SpaceX's Roberts Road facilities, there are some rather interesting updates in this flyover. At the Starship Launch Tower Assembly area, only 2 sections remain following the recent transport of the 4 sections to Texas. Interestingly though, these sections are seeing some significant work. On the 4th section, we can see that a permanent staircase is being added to the inside of the tower, and there's a missing connector plate on the steel in the middle of the far side of the structure. On the 5th section, all the steel for the bottom level has been removed from the structure. We can also see that the decking has been added to the middle level, as well as a permanent internal staircase between the middle and upper levels. It's not clear why the bottom level was removed, but given that these 2 sections hold the ship QD arm, they also house a lot of associated piping and equipment, so SpaceX could be reconfiguring this layout for their next launch tower. To the west, we see the chopsticks, carriage, and ship quick disconnect arm that are expected to travel to Texas with the remaining 2 tower sections. Unlike the QD arm and carriage, the chopsticks had crews actively working on them, likely trying to have them as complete as possible before they head to Starbase. On the north end of the Starfactory turned Hangar X Mark II building, we can see excavations and formwork for what look to be new foundations, indicating that they may be extending the building in that direction. On the west side of the building, the poured concrete walls of the new addition to that side have now been completed, with bent rebar sticking out, indicating that a poured concrete roof will be added in the near future. We can also see 2 large doorways into the existing building. What do you think this new addition will be for? We want to know what you think, so knock yourself out in the comments below. To the south, Blue Origin continues to push towards the inaugural launch of their New Glenn rocket. Many of the construction projects on the company's southern campus now appear to be complete. The addition to the warehouse building, the Reef Pathfinder building, the vertical assembly building, and also the new tent behind the warehouse no longer show signs of ongoing construction. A full parking lot also seems to indicate that the facilities are now in use. To the north, aside from the area being graded, there's no sign of construction beginning on the composite assembly building. On the south side of the company's northern campus, crews are working on some road widening as well as a new retention pond. Inside the tank cleaning and testing facility, we could see what is likely flight hardware on the building's test stand. Over near the shuttle landing facility, the Project Comet payload processing facility for Amazon's Kuiper satellites continues to see steady progress. Much of the building now has its cladding installed, and a concrete pump truck could be seen pumping concrete into a ditch near the corner of the building. Down the coast at Blue Origin's Launch Complex 36, New Glenn hardware was on the launch pad. While this vehicle is not necessarily flight hardware, it is the first New Glenn test article that will undergo tanking tests on the launch pad. This much anticipated 7-meter wide, 98-meter tall Methalox rocket is now moving into a much more exciting phase of testing ahead of its first launch, which is currently expected later this year. At United Launch Alliance's Space Launch Complex 37, the company's final Delta IV Heavy rocket is being prepared for its launch next month. A recent environmental impact statement filing told us that SpaceX hopes to transform this pad into a Starship launch site following the retirement of the Delta IV Heavy. And there you have it, another SpaceX and Starbase weekly update with a splash of Blue Origin brought to you by LabPadre. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button if you haven't already, and we'll see you next week. Thanks for watching. LabPadre out.